Does the name Mabel Constanduros mean anything to you? Do you know who she is? Well, not many people do until now. It's all about to change. She was a trailblazing female broadcaster and a comedian on BBC Radio in the 1920s, 30s and 40s. She's believed to be the creator and pioneer of the sitcom as a genre. She brought soap operas to the UK and she was widely known as the mother of the BBC. In other words, she was a national treasure, and yet she's become largely forgotten. Here's the woman herself talking about being one of the UK's first ever broadcasters.
I was a member of the first radio repertory company ever formed in 1925, when the personnel at 2LO numbered only 70 people. And I think my interest in drama is as great, if not greater, than my interest in variety.
Oh, how fantastic. And here she is performing in one of her sketches that she wrote and starred in.
This is London Calling. Here is Mabel Constanduros in her sketch entitled Grandma Buggins at the Zoo.
Cool, here we are at the zoo at last. I don't care much for monkeys myself, do you, Grandma? When you've got husbands, you lose your taste for them. Want to use your hanky, Grandma? Use your hanky, quick.
Love that. This is London Calling. Well, Mabel even appeared on early episodes of Woman's Hour, but despite that, here in the Woman's Hour office, we had never heard of her. That is, until we received an email from her great-great-nephew, Jack Shillito, contacted Woman's Hour after a lockdown project to look into his family tree that led him to discover his great-great-aunt and ignited a desire to find out more about her life and career. Welcome to Woman's Hour, Jack. What was it like hearing her voice?
Hi, Anita. Yeah, thanks for having me. That was quite surreal, actually. I've heard the comedy sketch before, but actually hearing her voice is quite strange. It kind of sends a bit of a shiver down your spine, like you're touching like history.
Yeah, because you went on this journey of discovery during lockdown.
Yeah.
Tell me about that.
Yeah, so just as lockdown hit, I lost my job. I started working for myself, but then as I was saying to you earlier, kind of like a cathartic project with being faced with a pandemic and redundancy, I decided to look into my family past. I knew there was some interesting story around the Tillings, who was my great-great-grandfather, and he ran a horse bus business in London, so pre-motorised transport, basically the Uber of the Victorian age. You could call up, you could hail a horse cab and that kind of thing. And then as I was looking at the Tillings, I saw that the name Constanduros, and I thought, who is this person? Shillito is quite an unusual name. Constanduros is quite an unusual name, but I thought I couldn't see the connection. And then I discovered she was actually the sister of my great granny. My great granny was still alive when I was born, so I was 4 when my great granny died. Mabel was my great granny's sister, so she's my great aunt.
And what did you discover about her?
Well, as in your introduction, she was a trailblazer, pioneer. She was extraordinary, and it's quite strange. I was thinking about this on the way in this morning. If you've ever seen Coco, the Pixar film, he discovers that his great-great-grandfather is a legendary musician. I felt a bit like that. I felt a bit like Coco, that I discovered my great-great-aunt was a legendary broadcaster. She was amazing. She was kind of the first of her kind. Yeah, as you know, last year BBC celebrated 100 years. Her career started shortly after. She was 45 when her career started. She was not divorced, but yeah, all intents and purposes, basically separated from her husband, which was not a done thing in the 20s. So yeah, she was basically supporting herself and her son, Michael, and her career started late. So there's so many. What I discovered was that she was extraordinary. Even in today, in like the 21st century. But when you look back, you go, hang on a second, it was 90 to 100 years ago. She's even more extraordinary. She's doing things well ahead of her time. And I was just completely bowled over by it. And then that led me to meet the likes of Jen, who's also researched Mabel.
Well, let's bring her in, because you started your own podcast called My Aunt Mabel, and one of your guests was indeed Professor Jennifer Purcell, Chair of History at St Michael's College. Jennifer's areas of expertise include the social and cultural history of 20th century Britain. She's written a book, an entire book about Mabel, of all the other fortuitous things that could have happened. You discover Jennifer, and the book is brilliantly entitled Mother of the BBC. Very early good morning to you, Jennifer, because we know you've woken up very early in the States to speak to us. So how did you first come across Mabel?
Good morning, and thanks for having me. I came across Mabel about 12 years ago. I had just finished a project called The Domestic Soldiers, which was about housewives during World War II. And I was sort of casting around for another project, and my publisher said, well, why don't you look into the BBC, because you talked about that in your first book. And so I said, okay. And I did some research, as you do as a historian, and started reading these books. And in the books, there's lists of entertainers, and that's what you read about. You read about lists and lists and lists. And Mabel kept showing up in those lists, but nothing more about her until I found one book on the social and cultural history of the early BBC, which was written in the 1990s. And it's the only one that really touches on the subject. And here she was in 2 paragraphs, not a list, but in 2 paragraphs. And in one paragraph, I was intrigued to learn that this woman was indeed, as Jack was saying, an amazing woman, an amazing performer. She could voice 7 different distinct voices in one go. In that clip that we just heard, that was only 2 of the 7 voices that she could do. And she fooled everyone. The BBC listeners at the time thought there was a cast of 7 actors doing this work. And I thought, wow, somebody has got to have written about her. And they hadn't. And then later on in the book, there's this little mention from Val Gielgud, who was a storied BBC staffer, producer, and so on, who attributed soap opera coming to the BBC and to Britain from America through Mabel Constanduros. And I thought, okay, I'm on to something here.
Yeah, she's a character.
So, yeah.
And she started really late. This is the bit that jumped out at me. She started her career in her 40s.
Yeah, late. So she was 45 when she went into broadcasting. So obviously we're like sat in the studio now, but as we know, radio's been around for about 100 years. I know what a microphone is. I know what a studio looks like, kind of thing. But she was just thrown into a studio, and her instruction was, well, there was a sign on the wall when she went into the studio that said, no jokes about Scotsmen, Welshmen or clergymen. Don't sneeze into the microphone. Off you go.
We've still got that sign.
Yeah.
But, you know, there couldn't have been that many women working at the BBC at the time. Certainly not women of her age. I mean, we're only just kind of speaking about how 45 isn't past it, you know, and she's starting her career at that age.
Right.
What a trailblazer, Jennifer.
Yeah, she is. And I think what's so fascinating about her is, as you said, you know, her age. But what really is intriguing about her is how she negotiated her way through the BBC, created a career. Not only did she create a career on the BBC, but she expanded that career into multiple media, which is just amazing to me.
How did she do that? How did she do that?
She would take her BBC sketches, the Bugginses, which is what we just heard, and she novelized them. So in the 1930s, she wrote multiple novels based on her characters. Eventually, she wrote soap operas, which became the predecessor for Mrs. Dale's Diary, which everyone knows. She was going to write Mrs. Dale's Diary, but got there were some contract negotiations that went south in the war, and so she's never been attributed to that. So she went into various different genres. She was in film. And she was, I call her a jobbing actor and writer, because how I got to know her was through the BBC with the written archives. I could see all the letters that go back and forth between her and the BBC. And she was constantly pitching ideas. Here, I want to do this. Can I do this? And it's a measure of the respect that she had from the BBC that most of those ideas in the 30s and 40s were picked up on. And she was given a contract to do that work. And she was working hard. So she's 45, but she was working hard on this career, raising her child, who at the time was around 8 years old, Michael, her son, who she was very close with. So she was managing all of this, being a mother. As Jack said, she's got this relationship with her husband too that we're not really sure about. So yeah, she's amazing.
She is amazing, and she fought for equal pay as well, Jack.
Yeah, she did. And she was very kind of, I think in the office, she was quite shy and she was very, very polite and very modest, but she was also pretty determined and persistent and resilient as well. And so she got on, as Jen was saying, with the likes of Val Gielgud, who was one of the BBC execs at the time. But she would send pretty stern letters to the BBC saying, I think you'll find that I I deserve the same pay as what you're paying my male colleague who's written the same sketch, or actually I'm the lead writer. Why is my male co-writer getting paid more? Or if I'm on my own, why do I get paid less? Like today, you can still imagine an email like that being sent. Like, why am I not being paid the same as my male colleague? But she was doing it 100 years ago, and she was getting. The BBC was saying, yeah, here you go, here's your equal pay. So it's actually, she wasn't just sending a letter; it was falling on deaf ears. It was working.
And has it changed you discovering that you have this ancestor?
Yes. Yeah. I kind of it was really interesting to discover her, but also there was kind of like a sense of inadequacy as well, because you look and you go, wow, like she started when she was 45, as Jen said. She was essentially a single mum. She was a writer, actor, performer. She was on stage. She was in films. She was hugely productive and busy during World War II as well. She led the Kitchen Front programme, which was helping families basically make meals out of their rationed items. So she was doing all that, and I kind of looked and thought, right, I better get cracking. Like, at least I need to make at least a podcast.
Otherwise, you feel really inadequate.
Yeah. So yeah, exactly. And it was just really nice to discover someone like that and know that she had such an impact on those around her as well. As you know, as Jen's book suggests, she was mother of the BBC. She was very encouraging to her colleagues as well at the time.
Yeah. What's her legacy, Jen?
I think her legacy, is the sitcom and the soap opera. The more I looked at her, she would never have been credited, and the BBC would never have been credited with early sitcom. And in fact, most scholars in this field would say that the Americans got to sitcom before the British did. And the only reason why they would say that is because here in America, we serialized our programs because everything was commercialized. And so we needed to do that. But the BBC fought against that until 1936. So in the 1920s, she knew her audience. She was also a creature of radio too. She understood audience. She understood how to do visual slapstick on the radio, where you could imagine somebody falling down a chimney, for instance.
Yeah.
Amazing stuff. Amazing stuff.
She sounds absolutely wonderful, and it's been such a pleasure to be able to bring her to life today on Woman's Hour. There is her legacy right there. Jack and Jennifer, thank you so much. Lots of you getting in touch about various things you've heard on the programme.